So, the Fishman is finally getting around to posting his video on railroad nationalization. This will not be his first video on the subject, however. Back at the end of 2020, Fisher posted a 10-minute video on the same subject, and his soon upcoming one is meant to be a more expansive and comprehensive follow-up. In preparation for it, I will be responding to the former, which seems to have quite a few problems.
Just so you know, I won't be mentioning in this video, but I will say that I do really like these graphs.
About the graphs at the beginning of the video, it is worth mentioning that part of the reason for this is the USSR just didn't have the money to build as many or as high quality roads as the US, so rail was the only, or at least better, option in many cases. So I was originally going to have this section poke fun at Fisher for saying Japanese railways are nationalized when they aren't, but when editing I found out that Fisher knows that, but put it on there anyway. All you really need to know for this bit is he lists some nationalized railroad networks along with JR and praises them. It should be noted, though, that the Brightline model is improving passenger rail in the US.
And then there is the US. 90% of US railroads lines are privately owned. Amtrak owns less than 700 miles of track and runs mainly on track owned by the big four private railroads: CSX, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, and BNSF. These companies routinely block Amtrak trains with freight either by accident or on purpose.
Yes, most tracks are privately owned, but that is not for no reason. For one thing, there are hundreds of miles of fairly intact abandoned, or fully intact inactive, right-of-ways that Amtrak could utilize, mostly in the eastern half of the country. It does not do this because the government, the same entity you want to run the railroads, refuses to invest. Secondly, given the U.S. is far more dependent on freight rail than passenger rail, it makes sense that most lines are freight-oriented. If all the passenger rail operations in the U.S. shut down tomorrow, yes, the effects would be devastating, but not nearly as much as if the same happened for all freight operations. This would be the opposite case in most of Europe. Yes, there are exceptions like Switzerland, but there are also countries like France that have barely any freight moved by rail, and consequently have way too many trucks on the road. To his credit, though, Fisher does admit the Amtrak issues to be a smaller problem.
But being made late by a freight train is a small problem compared to what these companies do for improving their rail infrastructure. And when I say improving, I mean either doing the bare minimum required for maintenance or actively making their logistics worse by single tracking some of the busiest main lines with the guise of using precision scheduled railroading. It's so obvious that most of these companies are only in it for the short-term profits.
Oh, is that why the Class 1s have so many inactive lines they've been holding on to, rather than selling the lines for salvage and then selling the land? That seems like a pretty short profit thing to do. Of all companies, Norfolk Southern, yes, them, held on to Saluda Grade, a line that is troublesome and even dangerous to operate, for over 20 years, and only recently has agreed to trail conversion. Many Class 1s spend money on heritage or otherwise special units, and the Union Pacific even has a steam program, something they wouldn't do if they just cared about short-term profits. The Class 1s have still been upgrading infrastructure fairly recently, like BNSF upgrading Renton Pass, Norfolk Southern's Heartland and Crescent Corridor projects, CSX's National Gateway project, among others. The reason Class 1 single-tracked lines is because they thought PSR would be a long-term commitment, but now it's clear it isn't working. As for Class 1's neglecting maintenance, this is A, due to the government, the same entity you want to run the railroads, being lazy and not enforcing safety rules, and B, the government having made a reliance for safety standards on themselves in previous decades, resulting in the railroads getting lazy about it. The current regulations are adequate, just not followed, and even in spite of that, the last decade has had the fewest train accidents in America's history. In general, more regulations actually help businesses monopolize as smaller businesses cannot afford conforming to regulations while bigger ones can, though due to their current nature this isn't as much the case with the railroads. However, it's certainly no excuse to throw on more.
So one solution,
huh? Are you going to compare it to any alternative solutions then?
to this is nationalizing the entire rail network.
So, railroads implementing a poor system is justification to hand them over to the government? Mistakes happen. You can't replace an operator every time they aren't perfect. With all the issues PSR is causing, its financial consequences will catch up to the Class 1s soon enough. Besides, some states are already moving to limit train lengths anyway. You don't throw away the whole system when a patch will do.
Nationalization isn't something that the US hasn't done before with anything else. The entire US interstate system is nationalized, with the roads being owned by either the federal government or state governments. It's not unusual for the federal government to pass large infrastructure bills supporting these pieces of infrastructure. One said bill was the reason why interstates were built in the first place, the Federal Highway Act of 1956.
While most U.S. highways are owned, operated, and paid for by the government, that is because, well, the government paid for their construction and planned to operate them from the start. It wasn't like there were a bunch of private highway networks and the government seized them all. Furthermore, if for some reason, somehow, a new for-profit highway network was built, the government probably wouldn't just immediately seize it.
Nationalization of U.S. railroads isn't a foreign concept either. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the competition from the interstate system along with long-distance trucking became commonplace, causing railroad traffic to decline. In the late 1960s, three large railroads, the Pennsylvania, the New York Central, and the New Haven, merged into one, forming Penn Central. Because of the terrible merger and the freight numbers, Penn Central filed for bankruptcy in 1970, later eventually disappearing in 1976. Many other railroads at the time also simultaneously went bankrupt, like the Reading Railroad, Erie-Lackawanna, Lehigh Valley, Central of New Jersey, and the Lehigh and Hudson. All of these bankruptcies caused a massive void in the U.S. transportation network.
One thing you conveniently neglected to mention is a large part of the reason for railroads declining at that time was the government, again, the entity running the railroads, was incompetent and regulated them like it was still the 1890s, funded competition with the railroads' tax dollars, and took forever to make decisions. The collapse of Penn Central and other northeastern lines was not solely the fault of the feds, of course, but they were if not the, primary cause, and the whole fiasco may have been avoided in the first place if the government actually ran the ICC well, when
the federal government came to help.
They were, in large part, cleaning up their own mess. Fisher does admit all of this in later videos, but it's at best neglectful and at worst deceptive that he omits it here.
And on the sixth day, the Fed said, "Let there be Conrail," and it was good. And without nationalization, it's dumb to think that a private company would ever run a train to smaller groups of population ever again.
Clearly this man has never heard of Class 2 and 3 railroads and pop-up metros. Even the Class 1s still have some branch lines.
Also, private corporations running infrastructure that both the public and the government rely on is such a heinous mistake.
So, does that mean we should nationalize grocery stores? Also, would you rather have important infrastructure be run by an organization that has financial incentive to do well, or by an organization with zero financial incentives, making decisions on the political whims of unqualified bureaucrats?
Alright, we're gonna talk about tax policy now. Hang in there. So generally, if a line is 2 tracks, it will get taxed more. Hence why a lot of modern railroads have single-track main lines in the United States. But this is only one side of the problem. The main part of the problem is how inefficient taxation and grants are with railroads. Generally, railroads will pay some sort of tax on their land. This tax will go to both federal and state governments. Money is then eventually redistributed into the railroads through grants and subsidies. These subsidies usually going to Amtrak for passenger operations and grants going back to private operators for infrastructure upgrades and maintenance. This causes the problem of needing extra personnel in between each of these transactions for bookkeeping, causing a loss of money and unnecessary costs.
Having those extra employees is fine if the private railroads handle things well, or at least better than the feds would.
Now, I'm sure you'll probably think, well, let's just stop taxing these companies so that they can use the cash in the first place to directly upgrade their infrastructure. Well, unfortunately, most private railroads in the US aren't in the business of railroading. As I said earlier, they're in the business of making short-term money. So the majority of the money saved in a for-profit company is directly funneled back into shareholders and upper management's hands, instead of back into upgrading infrastructure and for better service.
Already addressed this. Yes, more money should be going to upgrades rather than shareholders, but Fisher is making it out to be worse than it is, as I mentioned with the projects Class 1s have been investing in a few minutes ago. Also, it's worth noting that the government, the entity you want to run the railroads, makes it a legal obligation that the main goal of a company is to get money to the stockholders, hindering return investments.
So what's the solution to this? Well, you can either strengthen the unions to have some power to own the railroad to prevent shareholders from poaching cash.
I will be addressing the union and employee treatment things later in the video.
Or the other option is what majority of the countries around the world have chosen, and that is to divert to nationalization. Most of these problems could be fixed through nationalization and widespread investment into railroad infrastructure. I propose bringing Conrail back. Conrail would take over freight again and would maintain all mainline railroad infrastructure in the country, along with improvements to lines like electrification.
So before the first nationalization video, the Fishman also made a video on electrifying America's rail lines. Better I get this over with now. The Environmental Protection Agency stated that, in 2021, transport-based greenhouse gases contributed to 28% of the U.S.'s emissions. In that, rail only contributed to 2% of all transport-based air pollution. And that percentage is higher than normal since there were still less cars on the road and planes in the air due to COVID measures still lingering. And that is not 2% of all American pollution, but 2% of the 28%. So railroads, not just the Class 1s, but U.S. railroads in general, contribute a whopping 0.56% to American air pollution, in a situation where rail had a higher percentage than normal. And not even that entire 0.56 would disappear under Fisher's proposal, as not every line would be electrified. Not only is that negligible to American pollution, but even more so in the world as a whole. Even in cases of high local air pollution, like in Los Angeles, almost all of it comes from road vehicles, not locomotives. Not to mention nationalization isn't even necessary to electrify. The government could incentivize the railroads to do it. Would you rather have the Class 1s pay to electrify with some help from grants, or entirely by your taxes via a government already $35 trillion in debt? Yeah, I thought so. And I know there are other benefits to electrification besides the marginal environmental ones, like efficiency from dynamic braking's electricity going back into the wires, better acceleration, fluids from diesel locomotives getting into the environment, and less risk of a fire from diesel fuel or said fuel spilling, etc. However, it also has downsides like needing increased maintenance across the network, wires being more vulnerable to damage than rails, increased likelihood of workers and others near the line being electrocuted, increased vulnerability to electrical anomalies, and the chance of electrical fires. As for locomotive swaps, this taking a lot of time is largely due to a lack of effort on Amtrak's part. Back in the day, transfers between steam and electric, or between two steam locomotives, since many could not travel as far as diesels before needing maintenance, were as short as 5 minutes for lines like the New York Central system and Chicago and Northwestern. Fisher even acknowledges this in the comments, since most, if not all, stations where motive power transfers happen are in larger cities, a stop being at least 5 minutes is appropriate. Furthermore, Amtrak could simply utilize dual-mode locomotives with diesel power plants and pantographs, which they already do with diesel power plants and third rail. With this point of New Jersey Transit electric commuter lines being better than diesel ones, that can be explained as diesel branches have less traffic and are more out of the way than electrical lines, resulting in them having poor service, not them being diesel powered. I know electrification could reduce issues with oil prices going up and down, but would also bring its own host of exclusive issues as I already mentioned. Dozens of new power plants would have to be built across the country to power the rail network. Wind and solar are not nearly sufficient to power a network of that size, at least not on their own. While nuclear would be preferred, that has a weird stigma around it that would be difficult to overcome. A few coal and or natural gas power plants would produce less emissions than thousands of diesel locomotives, but it would make the already negligible reduction in air pollution even more negligible, while simultaneously worsening local air pollution. Tidal and geothermal power could only be used in certain areas on the coast and inland respectively, and neither are fully matured technologies yet. Hydropower stations cause damage to local ecosystems, and it can be difficult to find good places for them. The Colorado River is already overflowing with dams. I'll see myself out. There would also be pollution from mining and refining all the copper or aluminum needed for the wiring, as well as from mining and refining other materials needed for the project. Even if the metals were recycled, or the wires were some carbon fiber-esque thing, there's still a lot of pollution going into all that. So, Fishman, if you want the feds, who are already laden with debt, spending somewhere between the GDP of Ireland and Australia on a project which is primarily justified on environment, shouldn't it, I don't know, get rid of at least a singular percentage point of US air pollution? Because electrifying even the entire US rail network, which is going farther than your proposal, with generous percentages, would not even accomplish that. Railroads are just so fuel efficient that we could still be using steam locomotives and the pollution from them would still be negligible compared to the rest of the nation's emissions, let alone the world's. So not only is nationalization not necessary, and perhaps even detrimental to electrification, since in that case it would be only government money spent and not any from the private sector, but it would be doing about as much to save the polar bears as shipping a few dozen boatloads of ice to the oceans around the poles and dumping them into the water. The Federal Railroad Administration themselves stated in 1984 that electrification wouldn't do much for the environment. Removing 0.084% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and realistically, it would not even be that, does not begin to come anywhere close to remotely justifying the cost of electrifying the US rail system, even with the other potential benefits of electric traction. If we estimate, conservatively, a cost on average of $2.5 million per track mile based on FreightWave's estimates, and multiply that by 160,000 miles, the US rail network size, that's $4 trillion. We don't have to electrify everything. Again, this also furthers the negligibility of the reduction in air pollution. As I said, 2.5 billion per mile is a lower estimate, with the upper limit at 4.8. Not to mention massive infrastructure projects like these always seem to go over budget anyways, in addition to suffering delays. While it is possible, perhaps even likely, in future that road and air traffic could go down and rail traffic could go up, our current level of rail traffic would have to more than double to even reach 2% of America's emissions. And all this assumes a nationalized US rail network would want to electrify in the first place, because it being government-owned far from guarantees that. As we know, a lot more pollution comes from highways and airlines. Want to know who subsidizes those? That's right, the feds. I'm not saying we shouldn't electrify any lines or that electrification is inherently bad or anything, but we should be careful where we put it and why, and do so sparingly. Few Class 1s had large electric segments in the past, and the few who did built them for very specific reasons. The Milwaukee Roads line was cold and mountainous, so it was hard for locomotives to build up steam. The New Haven, Reading, and Pennsylvania electric segments were in dense, passenger-centric areas. The Great Northern had a really long tunnel in a mountainous area. The Virginian was a coal road and had coal power plants and was operating in mountainous terrain. Oh yeah, it's also kind of funny that part of the reason Conrail ditched electric operations was because Amtrak, a fellow government entity, was charging them too much to use the wires on the Northeast Corridor. A certified government moment. Places like Cajon Pass, the Long Island Railroad, and the Chicago Racetrack are good electrification candidates, but places like those don't represent the entirety of US mainlines. So in terms of things to do concerning environmental friendliness, as electrifying railroads are among the most expensive projects, while simultaneously having next to no effect on emissions output, it should be pretty close to the bottom of the list of things to do, if on the list at all. Any additional benefits it brings don't do enough to counteract this, even if we ignore the downsides that come with it as well.
Private companies could still own and operate their freight on the network too. They would lease out lines and run their services. This is very similar to how European railways do their services, similar to FlexiTrain in Germany.
Fisher mentions leasing lines, rather than simply having companies pay to use the track. He reiterates this in his supply chain video. However, in that same supply chain video, he complained about some railroads having monopolies for some cities. Leasing a route does not solve this problem. The customers still only have one service to pick from if only one road can lease a route. Also, it is a bit strange how the fishman complained about some cities having only one rail carrier to choose from, but in his Rails to Trails video, he called the Reading and Pennsylvania Railroad rivaling mainlines goofy. In fairness, goofy doesn't necessarily mean bad, but I think it definitely could have meant that in that context.
Class 2 and 3 railroads could also still exist privately too, because Conrail would only operate mainline services, so Class 2 and 3 railroads would still need to exist for freight hubs.
My guy, you were just complaining that only a nationalized railroad network would bother giving service to small communities, and now you're saying smaller private railroads would primarily do this since the nationalized network would focus on the main lines. Pick a narrative and stick to it.
Nationalization would use Conrail to turn the current U.S. rail network into basically a copy of the interstate system, where the government owns the rails and infrastructure, but any company can use them if they pay the toll. The main benefit with these improvements through nationalization would be with Amtrak and passenger rail in the United States. Amtrak could truly have control over all of the lines and could manage and set up new lines with ease.
The main problem with Amtrak is that, while its trains have the right of way by law, the government, the same entity wants to run the railroads, refuses to enforce said law. The freight companies taking advantage of this isn't because of profit, it's just human nature. People don't like to do inconvenient things, and likely won't if they're not forced to. If a park has a no smoking rule, but it's not enforced, and people know it's not enforced, they're going to smoke, even with the risk of starting a fire or others being injured from secondhand smoke. The same goes for safety inspections not being as frequent as they should. As I said earlier, this wouldn't be a problem if the government simply bothered enforcing the current system. We don't need a new one, it's just the current one isn't being acted upon.
Amtrak and Conrail could work together to improve infrastructure and build new high-speed rail corridors as well.
High-speed rail, in almost all situations, isn't supposed to share tracks with freight trains except maybe around terminal areas. Whether the government invests in high-speed rail is almost completely irrelevant to the business of freight railroads.
Commuter railroads like NJ Transit would also benefit. With nationalization, integration of services into a larger network would be a hell of a lot easier. NJ Transit could open new lines that were once owned by private companies easier too, like the CSX main line that runs from Manville to Ewing Township.
Like with Amtrak, there are many abandoned right-of-ways that could be utilized for corridor services, but the government, the same entity you want to run the railroads, refuses to invest. As for routes operated by freight railroads, local governments buying terminal areas, with railroads selling them voluntarily, is not unheard of, and freight railroads often share terminal lines or use a dedicated terminal railroad, so they're used to not owning these types of lines. That's a lot easier, more justifiable, not to mention far cheaper than buying out the entire system.
The US truly has a long way to go before even coming close to any of those countries that I stated in the beginning. But I truly think that nationalization is the first huge push in the right direction to get that train moving.
So, you're telling me you're not going to so much as mention the United States Railroad Administration, or the Alaska Railroad. Those sure seem pretty relevant to the conversation, as those are instances of a federal and state government taking over rail operations respectively. What possible reason could you have to not include these? I can get you forgetting about the Alaska Railroad, but what about the USRA? You even acknowledge the USRA in the comments. What, are you afraid to bring up the USRA's issues and the government incompetence that led up to it because it would undermine your narrative? So yeah, this first video on nationalizing railroads isn't very good. I understand he couldn't elaborate very much given the video's length, and this was earlier in his YouTube career, but even so, there are a lot of mistakes and things he left out. If he actually wants to convince people in his next video, it needs to be higher quality. Also, on his second channel, he posted what I can only call a hype-up video in preparation for his second nationalization video. The main message is, take the railroads back. Assuming you mean for the US public, it never belonged to us. I have a feeling you're going to use a certain argument using something you touched upon in your supply chain video, and I'll get to that momentarily. So if you were being honest, or maybe just correct, I don't know, it would just be called take the railroads. Another thing, something belonging to the government isn't the same as it belonging to the public. Few people say the military belongs to the public, but it's run by the government. He also said the private railroads own our country. So when corporations are meddling in the government, the solution is to take the industries away from them and give them to the government, which the corporations control. And also, who's to say people even want it? I got someone to make a couple of Reddit polls for me, and yeah, the results show that a majority of American respondents want at least partial nationalization, but that isn't an accurate representation of the US population, and I hope we all know that Reddit users aren't exactly the most intelligent community the internet has to offer. Guessing that if you ran a poll that reached a larger and more diverse group, most people would say to leave things as they are. Now, while we are finished watching this first video, I'm going to go over 2 predictions I have for points he will have in his next one. These 2 are that A, since the feds helped a lot of railroads get off the ground, this somehow means they belong to them. B, railroads treat workers badly and the government would treat them better. Concerning point A, this reasoning is similarly bad to his reasoning about the whole corporation versus government control, but unlike that, you actually have to take a second to think about it. While various levels of government giving grants to railroad companies did greatly accelerate the expansion of railroads across the country, there are 2 things Fisher fails to take into account. 1, if you give someone a gift, said someone isn't indebted to you and have no obligation to return the gift, or anything they have made from it. In addition, in most cases where the government loaned railroads money, they paid it back. While a grant is not the same as a gift, the logic still stands. Jeff Bezos' parents loaned him some money to start Amazon. Imagine if at some point they claimed that, despite the loan being repaid, since the loan got the company off the ground, Amazon belonged to them. That, of course, would be absurd. And yet this is the logic that I think Fisher is hinting at. The second thing Fisher fails to take into account is that, even if the railroads did somehow owe the government at one point, they have more than repaid it countless times over with their contributions. The railroads over the years have given countless US citizens jobs, with at one point being the industry with the largest amount of workers, helped the country expand, drove economic development, transported supplies and troops during war, had to deal with the government's overregulation and funding its competition, among countless other things. Yes, there have been mistakes, like easily preventable accidents, causing strikes, contributing to pollution, and so forth, but unless you're a primitivist, the good the railroads have done for the nation undeniably outweighs the bad. Also, by this logic, any lines built without significant government loans or grants should be exempted from nationalization, which I don't think the Fishman wants. As for my second prediction on Fisher's points, about worker treatment, in fairness he kinda has a point here. Job conditions would likely somewhat improve, at least for conductors and engineers, if the railroad was government owned. But wanna know something funny? They'd have better conditions right now if the government, the entity you want to run the railroads, hadn't intervened on the would-be strike in 2022. If you're going to condemn the railroads for bribing the government, you must equally condemn the government for taking the bribe. If the railroad companies in your eyes aren't allowed to exist anymore because of this, why should the government take over operations if they're just as responsible? Even if I'm generous and give this point to Fisher, one point doesn't overwhelm all the others. So no, the railroads shouldn't be run by the feds. Are they perfect now? Of course not, but what Fisher proposes will worsen most things in the long term. Private companies have a sense of self-preservation and won't usually make decisions on political whims, but this is rarely the case of public ones. You probably noticed a running theme here that a lot of these issues are either due to or wouldn't be fixed by the feds taking over. Once PSR is gone, a freight system is more than sufficient. Sure, the Class 1's handling more local freight would be nice, but that doesn't require much, if any, government intervention to change, and if it does, it can easily be done through positive motivation, not negative. As for passenger trains, as stated, nationalization is not necessary for that either, especially with the success of Brightline's model, meaning that private passenger networks could start popping up across the country. I'm not saying nothing good would come out of nationalization or the system would collapse overnight, just that how we have things now with some adjustments is both easier to achieve and will have better results than a nationalized network. Thanks for watching to the end of the video. This is the first time I've really made a YouTube video like this, so sorry if it comes off as slideshow-like. The audio probably also isn't the best, as I just record this with my phone. Not to mention, if you can't tell, I don't have the best speaking voice. If you're wondering what else I'm going to do with this channel, I will likely be making a follow-up video when Fisher makes his follow-up video. Also, if, however unlikely it is, Fisher directly responds to my response, I guess I'll talk about that too. If you're watching, hi Alan. After that, I'm considering responding to BritMonkey's banning Cars video and that movement in general, but no promises. In the unlikely scenario I start uploading things regularly, it will likely be for projects that are more original and aren't just me yapping at others' yappings. I don't plan on YouTube being a career or even a long-term hobby for me, but anything is possible, I guess. I'm not going to ask you to subscribe because, well, like I said, this channel probably won't see much more, if any, use. If you wish to speak to me more directly and continuously than in the comments, I am in the Discord servers of both PansyFan19's and Train of Thought's YouTube channels, so you can find me there.